Hello?
Service as well as local authorities, the public sector as a big landowner. So here are the issues about how is that to be released. The volume builders are unlikely to greatly increase their council is here. Balancing the need for more housing with other local needs. And talk about the funding landscape. We have Kate Davies of Notting Hill, the Housing Association, to give their perspective. Mark Eden of Regal, a mid-sized London developer, can talk about how they find and fund the land. And then we have Neil Jefferson. We're grateful to him for stepping in at short notice, replacing one of his colleagues who couldn't make it, of NHBC, talking about the standards of build. And Aldermore and NHBC are both sponsors of this. You can't hear me? No. Oh.
That again.
Right, well, we're not going over all that again. You got the point. I'm sure you could hear me just about, but not as well as you should be able to. So, fine, let's get going. And Richard, you give us 5 or 6 minutes on your perspective. Now, can we hear you? See if we can.
I think you can hear me from the sound of it. Good-o. Right, well, firstly, welcome to Islington. Welcome to the Emirates Stadium. I am told it is Britain's finest club football stadium, built on the site of Islington's ex-municipal tip. So if you were here 15 years ago, you'd currently be standing where the council's bin lorries used to be parked. And if you ask our Spurs supporting director of regeneration, he'd say it was still the equivalent of the municipal tip, but, you know, he also saw the whole project through to completion. And I think, actually, this stadium, which was delivered as well as a world-class football stadium with thousands of new homes, a new municipal tip, so don't worry, our bin lorries still have somewhere to go, and a whole range of other regeneration benefits, I think is a fantastic example of what happens when councils, the private sector, the mayor and others can work together to get something exceptional achieved. And you know, this stadium is at the heart of our borough in many ways, and it was only built because of an incredible 10-year-long partnership project between a lot of different stakeholders. So, from Islington, we consider ourselves a pro-development borough. We have massively exceeded our housing targets set by central government every year for the 6 years that my administration has been in power. And we're very proud to do that. We know there is a London housing crisis, and we welcome the growing consensus that the housing crisis isn't just the biggest challenge facing the lives of residents, but it's the biggest challenge facing the lives of our businesses and our employees as well. And speaking as the kind of chairman of the biggest employer in the borough, we know our ability to kind of maintain the massive progress we've seen in schools quality, in attracting the kind of key workers that we as a council need. The biggest challenge we now face is affordable housing, and it must be the same for businesses all the way across London, where if we are serious about having an inner London where genuinely affordable housing is shorn out of it, well, I don't see anyone seriously investing in the public transport necessary to take millions of people from the outer London suburbs into the middle of our city in order to have if market forces are just let rip about housing in inner London. You know, the housing crisis is grave, and the mayor was elected with a solution to do it, and I'm delighted that he appointed James Murray, who was my cabinet member for housing in Islington, as his deputy mayor for housing, and I think James is a man who knows an awful lot around this issue and will do a great job. So, talking about land, I'll chuck some thoughts out there very briefly, if that's okay, Lorca, and then leave more time for questions. So we have the Land Commission. I think the Land Commission seems to have got so far as a register of public land. It includes Highbury Fields, which I have to tell you no one is going to be developing on. It includes 10 Downing Street and a whole range of other public assets as well, which are not credible housing development sites. And I do think a lot of work is needed to essentially separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to public land. There's a lot of public land that is deliverable, but people talk about the thousands and thousands of hectares that TFO own. Well, quite a lot of that has actually got a train line on it, and no one's going to be building a house in the middle of that. And so I think, we look at some of the raw figures about public land, but we actually have to take a more sensible approach about what is actually developable land and what isn't. There is the vexed question of estate regeneration. I think in Islington we take a different approach to some of our neighbouring boroughs. I mean, we are very much driven by the needs of our residents. We should never forget that estates are people's homes. They're homes to about a third of people in our borough. And that while we think a lot of that housing was badly designed, we think that in it, we've got a really strong process of infill development in Islington. So I'll give you an example of the Dover Court estate, 10 minutes walk away from here in Highbury, where we are building 70 new homes on that estate, 70% of which are affordable, 30% for private sale, which we can do because we're the landowner, but we think you can get as big a uplift on that estate through infill development as you can if you knocked it down and started again, but in taking 10 less years and in spending a lot less money doing that. Now, that's not true for every estate. There have been some fantastic examples of comprehensive estate regeneration in Islington. Just look at the Packington estate, which is quite famous. Look at the Market estate. But that would talk an awful lot of government subsidy. The government put aside £100 million part of its estate regeneration fund. The Packington estate alone to get that scheme took £50 million of government subsidy. So I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about the levels of subsidy required to make those schemes really, really fly. I then want to talk about skill shortages, the thing we spend a lot of time thinking about at the moment, and it is appalling, I use that word advisedly, appalling that London simply cannot build the homes it needs, and that as a major constructor ourselves as a local authority, we will come up against the same challenges many of you will come up against, as simply not having labour shortages that hold back an enormous number of schemes. It was going to take, in my view, some pretty fundamental change in the interaction between the construction industry, the skills sector, to put those right. I'm very happy to flesh out my views on this. We've done a lot of thinking about it more in the question and answer session. But I get told by constructors that no one coming out of an FE college in London is employable because the skills they are being taught are out of date. But I get told by people trying to place people into the construction sector that the people that they are able to do, then there's very little interest because constructors don't employ people anymore. It's all self-employed. There's no holiday pay. Lots of constructors have said to me privately that why do they bother having apprenticeships and training people and then they can import all the labour they need from Poland. And so there is a major, major challenge that they face where, as in my job where you get to talk to both sides, you hear some pretty conflicting stories about what's going on. And if I may finish on this point, I think these panels are terrible if everyone just sits here and agrees with each other. So I'm going to make one very contentious point, if I may, which I want to push the question back to you, which is how much of the land supply for new housing is already taken up in unacted upon permissions. The Secretary of State came to Local Government Association conference over the summer and said the planning system was delivering 220,000 permissions each year, which is what this country needs, but there was nothing like that being actually completed. And so I just want to ask the question of you, so what can we do, given there are the permissions given each year to solve our housing crisis, but not the starts made? What can we do then to get acting upon those things where actually the planning system has delivered and permissions have been given, but for whatever reason those permissions aren't being built out? And I think that has to be a part of this debate as well. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me properly now? You can now. Thank you very much, Richard. The very clear challenges there from the leader of a major local authority, particularly about fundamental change being needed to address skills shortages in the interaction between the construction industry and the education sector, and also about how much land has permission for development but isn't being acted on, as well as a description of what has been achieved in a borough that has exceeded housing targets. So we'll come back to many of those points as we have this discussion, but let's ask Charles of Aldermore to tell us particularly about the funding landscape, and any other comments he wants to make.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Delighted to be here as a lifelong Manchester United fan. Aldermore was formed in 2009, right in the teeth of the recession by design. One of the earliest things we did was to form a property development division, because what is missing totally is finance for the SME builder. And clearly, a lot of the big banks will focus on the big PLC builders, nothing wrong with that. But the big PLC builders cannot take up the demand, whether it's in London or anywhere else. The requirement for SME builders to come in is just absolutely critical. I think one of the key things is that the number of SME builders has absolutely dropped dramatically. I think it's something like 50% less firms from pre-recession to now. So I think as lenders, we have a duty, as well as everybody else in the industry, to find new and innovative ways of funding, particularly the SME builders. We've done some research that shows that 1 in 5, on average, of those SME builders and developers still finds it hard to find finance. So 20% of all aspiring developments might be stalling because of lack of finance. Often people have less equity to put into schemes, and that's a result of actually some of them quite sensibly contracting themselves during the recession, but now find it hard to come back out and find the equity to fund more sites. Some of the schemes that we fund are some of the very good quality SME builders. They use what's called mezzanine finance to top slice the missing equity. That is very expensive. It's good, but it's very expensive. So, our call is to government and other policymakers to work with us to find more schemes that can help SME builders fund more sites. The other thing I would say is, and it's not a plea for us poor banks, so we never dream of doing that, but some of the smaller banks who have got an appetite to lend to SME builders have got pretty much unfair capital treatment. So for us, for example, we need 7 times more capital than the average high street bank to lend to a developer. Now, we still do it, but that cannot be right. So I think we need a joined-up housing policy going forward that also concentrates on funding the SME builder as a critical part of its policy.
Thank you. That is very clear. Again, we must come back to that. You can't help but think banks are actually missing an opportunity in what they could do here, but we will return to that. Kate Davies from Notting Hill Association.
The first thought I thought about that was come and talk to housing associations if you're a small or medium builder, because one thing we don't have much trouble with is getting money. Today I've got £400 million ready to invest at very low interest rates, and we are interested in combining with people who've got land, because that is our problem area, getting hold of land. I'm sure you're right, Richard, that the people are sitting on planning permissions, but it is really about bringing everything together, isn't it? The political will, the land opportunity, the planning, and the finance, and the skilled labour, as you've mentioned. So sometimes those are in the hands of other parties, so the need really for partnerships to make some of this happen, all led by a strong political will, which I feel is the primary issue. If we had national and local politicians really wanting to do something serious about housing, we could get it going, but there needs to be a much greater lead, I feel, nationally, locally, and from the mayor. Everybody's talking about it, but it really needs some groundbreaking thinking, I think, to make it really take off.
Thank you. Well, we can also come back to what that groundbreaking thinking should be. Let's take the other opening comments. Mark from Regal, what would you like to say on these subjects?
So, hopefully everyone can hear me. As an SME developer and contractor, purely focused on the London market, Zone 2 and Zone 3, our main obstacles since we were incepted about 20 years ago has always been finance, has always been the amount of time it takes to deliver a site. Because as an SME house builder, you're always concerned about cash flow, when the next project's going to complete, when you're going to get your funds topped up so you can go and reinvest them. And also, the main obstacles for timing has always been we need to extract value from land, and because the planning process is such a myriad of red tape and different from council to council, we're very selective on which land we buy, which land we develop, and the timing it's going to take to develop that land. And the third issue around the planning, the cost of developing a 20 or 30 unit or 50 unit scheme just above the affordable housing threshold of 10, let's say, is prohibitively disproportionate to us looking at a 100 or 150 unit scheme in London. So if SME house builders are really going to motor, then we've got to have some deregulation and subsidies around finance, to assist these poor bankers to get money into the market, because they do find it difficult. That wasn't said in jest. And the third, the last bit is the availability of land and how we find land. Obviously, we can go private or public. The public barriers for an SME is timing, getting involved in a process where you're one of, potentially 80 or 90 SME house builders looking at a parcel of land, which has happened very recently in one of the local boroughs around here. And also trying to work on a joint venture basis. If we identify a strategic parcel of land, are we going to get pushed out by the OJU process because we don't have enough capital to see that process through, and someone from Holland or Germany ends up developing our patch of land around the corner from the office? That could happen. So that's the public side, so we're feared off by those challenges. The private side, again, finding access to land is very, very difficult. There's a lot of, but we've had a lot of success with landowners who have absolutely no idea how to deliver land, and even if they get the planning permission, would not be backed by the banks to develop that land. So we've had a lot of opportunity in Hackney and Tower Hamlets, where we've gone to landowners where regeneration of old industrial units has been, key to them, because, industrial in the East End hasn't happened, hence the explosion of the whole area of Shoreditch and Hoxton and Hackney. And we've had a lot of success working with those landowners, bringing forward planning permissions, because we've had the luxury of time, we haven't had the pressure of finance, and delivering those sites. So those are the key challenges. There's solutions that I can touch upon later.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, this panel is already really bringing out how many things have to be brought into alignment and how many blockages have to be released in order to make a success, even of quite small projects, and obviously so for the big ones as well. And of course, the other thing that has to be brought into alignment and watched all the time is the standards. So just before we come back to all of these issues, Neil from NHBC, you give us your views on this.
So I think know that our role is to set standards, inspect homes and provide warranties to homeowners. And we do that. Challenges that lie ahead, it's worth highlighting the positive news story, which was in the depths of the financial crisis in 2008. NHBC was registering about 80,000 homes, and at the moment our run rate is currently about 160,000 homes. So that's a considerable growth for an industry that doesn't tend to achieve double-digit growth year on year. So that's the sort of levels we've got at the moment.
We've got another sound problem now.
Okay.
I'll just bring you another microphone.
So just to say, as well as the quality work that we do in setting standards and inspecting, we've got a lot of information about the numbers across the UK and the growth. And you may have heard me say then that that's been quite impressive. We're currently doubled the size of the industry since 2008, but still with a long way to go. In picking up London, London in 2013 and 2014, those were bumper records of registrations. They're the best numbers of home registrations that NHBC has on record for London. So that's the sort of good news that we've seen. Against that, however, in terms of looking at the shape of the recovery and what's making that up, it's unlike almost any recovery we've seen before, because it's absolutely dominated by the big builders building more homes on big sites. And actually, picking up on Mark's point and the comments from the panel, it's really quite interesting to look at. In the 1980s, there were 12,000 SMEs on our register building less than 100 homes a year. That number now is less than 3,000. So a massive drop there. And actually, when I talk about the increase in homes that have been registered since 2008, We've seen a 65% drop in that segment of house builders since 2008 to 2016. So there's clearly a big issue about getting the small builders building again, and our information is supported by information held by other organisations as well. So whilst our main concern is to make sure that in this growth period that homes are being built to good quality, we're also interested to make sure that there are small builders coming into the industry. And we've done some research as well. I'm only really going to repeat the points that were made by the panellists. Now, the first finding that we got from the focus groups that we held was that planning was the biggest issue. Now, that's not surprising, because I think that any meeting that we arrange where we get house builders together, planning will always be the first issue. But I think the main point, really, picking up Richard's point, was not about permissions. It was more Mark's point, which is about delays. Small builders cannot afford delays in terms of getting out on site. They've got to get on site as quickly as possible, because those delays will send them under. So planning was the number one issue. Finance was number two. I think the reasons unpicking that was really been mentioned already by the panellists, was maybe the attitude of the big banks. There was a loss of local banking and a lack of understanding of what small builders are trying to do around the country. Land availability was one that also featured in the top four as well. And the sorts of suggestions we had there from small builders was about carving up these big sites to make them more accessible for smaller builders. And the final piece was skills, which has been touched on, I'm sure we'll come back to. So that research was carried out in 2014. We've repeated it this month, and the story's still the same. And I find that quite disappointing, because there have been quite a number of initiatives by banks, by government, in terms of reducing requirements for social housing on small sites, for example, but that doesn't seem to be having an impact. And the feedback from this month is that, on the planning issues, is that maybe some of these new policies that government are putting into place are not being applied consistently and nationally. So that, again, undermines the confidence for small builders.
Thank you. Well, all of those presentations have been extremely clear, actually, and very striking what Neil just said about the reduction in the number of small builders by 3/4, really, since the 1980s, is what you're saying. Those registered with the NHBC, and you listed some of the reasons for that. And there are several issues being raised in the last 10 minutes that we should come back to. But on that one of small builders getting finance for a start, what specifically can be done in order to change that? If you were the Minister for Housing or the Mayor of London, what could you do about that?
Well, or even the Treasury or the Bank of England. I think there are opportunities for some of the larger banks to put a particular focus on SME builders. I think that's something that needs to be looked at. It's very hard to know how much lending actually is being lent to SME developers and builders. And I think also, there's something around making some of the government schemes more well known. I mean, the British Business Bank has done a good job in trying to promote a guarantee scheme to lenders, but the take-up is currently very low, interestingly. And I think it comes back to a few smaller lenders trying to do the best they can, but inevitably, to get scale, we need to get some of the bigger lenders to focus not just on the big PLCs, but on some of the smaller, good quality. And I'll give you a good example. It was a builder I talked to who did the right thing. He was encouraged by his bank when the recession came upon him to retract and stop building, because he had a really good, profitable history with good profits in the bank, and wait until the recession kind of passed, then come back out and start building. He took the bank's advice and didn't build for 2 years, still very, very wealthy, no problem at all. When he came back to build, the bank said, "We can't lend to you because you haven't got a recent track record of building." Now, that just sums it up for me. It's just a kind of an attitude thing. So it's a combination of willingness to lend, but also I think there's more we can do. For example, Help to Buy on the purchase side was really successful government policy. Restarted high LTV house building post the recession. Very good. Something similar in favour of the SME builder, like a Help to Build type thing. I think there are opportunities to discuss with lenders those kind of schemes.
Any other ideas on that on the panel before we move on to, yes, Kate?
Yeah, I think it is quite clear, and you established it in the first session, that the very large builders have got a quantity of homes that they can build out, but there is some limit to that. So when you need additional supply, where is it going to come from? And SMEs are being put forward as part of the answer, but I would like to put housing associations forward as part of the answer, and local authorities as well. At the moment, local authorities are only building 3,000 or 4,000 units nationally, And yet in the past, they were the people who built all the homes, I mean, a lot of homes. And that is the main group that has fallen behind. Housing associations have started to take up the slack to some extent, and Notting Hill builds about 1,500 homes a year, and many housing associations have got development programs of that scale. But we could scale up. We really have the ability to increase the supply. And we are, as I say, quite well funded, not from the public purse, but from the bond markets, essentially. So I think everybody has to make an effort. I mean, as a supermarket says, every little helps. Every little helps in terms of housing provision. But we need to encourage all the sectors to make a contribution. And I would like to see local authorities, small builders, and housing associations all contributing to this sort of national campaign to create more homes for Britain.
Well, what does the local authority think to that, Richard?
We would be enthusiastic about going back to being a large-scale builder again. There's one thing that we think needs to happen to do that, which is the lifting of the borrowing cap on local authorities to build. We're not arguing for anything financially imprudent. We still think all of the rules about prudential borrowing should apply to that money. But what we are saying is there's these arbitrary and we think unevidenced and unfair rules that limit local authority borrowing. So for a borough like ours that's heavily leveraged from housing investment in the past means we are, for no good reason as far as I can tell, limited from playing our part in being a developer ourselves and driving that money back through the economy.
Any reaction to that on the panel? Mark?
Ultimately, there's been a staggering statement that we need to build, or the government needs to build 1 million homes over the next 4 years, which is never going to happen unless you get the SME market moving, which is unfortunately going to take a number of years to do, and you get the local boroughs and councils and affordable housing providers building again. There's no supply. Everyone focuses on demand. When everyone was concerned about price points in London, everyone hit taxation and hit demand. Unfortunately, if you don't deal with supply, you're always going to have a housing crisis. London, in particular, is an international community. It's it is a global financial centre. There is a significant amount of wealth moving through London, and if you don't provide the right homes, you're not going to deal with pricing. So we've got to deal with supply at the grassroots. In terms of funding, personal experience, and I won't go into too much detail, there's 22 funding schemes provided by government. There's 2 the SME market can look at. When you have a site and you really want to get going, as you were saying before, you're not going to go to the government to get your funding because there's too much red tape, it takes too long, there's no transparency in pricing. You might as well go and speak to an Aldermore or Lloyds, because you'll be able to get your funding with much more visibility. And that's the key issue here, that you get a lack of clarity from government as to what's being provided. And I think if there was clear, robust financial provisions and incentives for SMEs, and the local councils had clear land lists which could be provided to a list of SMEs rather than the whole market, but approved SMEs, I think that might push the market. There's too much focus on the larger house builders and less of the SMEs. So.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want us to return in this session to some of the challenges Richard laid down at the beginning, but let's take some questions from the floor. Yes, here at the front, a microphone is on its way. Yes.
Peter Mapson, I'm a small SME. I'm a rare beast, obviously, it would appear. I just wanted to comment on Richard's point. The reason that we can't build all the consents we have, and we have to land bank, is for continuity. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't have the ability to go from one project to another, because I have no way of guaranteeing how long it's going to take me to get my next planning consent. For example, at the moment I have a pre-application request in with a council, which we paid the fee for and sent the stuff in 6 months ago. I still don't have the benefit of a meeting with them, just for a pre-application meeting. So it's impossible to quantify. So you have to land bank to a degree to ensure that I have a project to go on to and I don't stop and start my business.
So you're saying the question of planning delays and people not acting on all the permissions are linked issues.
Yes, if I built everything
Those
we
can be
had,
solved together.
if I built everything we had, we'd then have a complete stop. Well, it might make me 2 years to get something else. And
Yes.
then I'd have to lay everyone off. It's huge.
Richard, what do you think? What do you make of that?
I mean, I can see that argument. I mean, I do think we've got ourselves into, by hook or by crook, by a series of well-meaning but bad decisions added up together by governments involving all three parties into a real mess on where we are about planning and viability. I think the current system of competitive viability assessments, which drives a lot of Islington's concern about house building, because while we're a pro-development borough, we're pro the right kind of development, is driven by desire to get genuinely affordable housing for residents living in absolutely abysmal housing circumstances in our borough. You know, we have Dickensian housing conditions of some of our residents in this borough, and we are determined to try and help those people by getting them affordable housing. But if we could go back to being a major developer because the ludicrous borrowing cap was abolished, then actually we'd be far less interested in having to squeezing of private developers for every last unit of affordable housing, because we'd be confident in our own supply. And the whole viability argument just becomes a zero-sum game, as written into kind of London Plan and all sorts of other things as well. So we are looking to James and Sadiq to break out of the current zero-sum game approach to viability, which we think is as unhelpful as anyone else does. You know, people in here will spend a lot of money on viability. Consultants show they couldn't possibly afford to provide us any affordable housing. We then spend a lot of money on viability. Consultants show, no, actually, you really can. And it just becomes this awful conflictual process, which costs you money, costs us time, and the residents are the losers from that. And so I think we have to have some big thinking to break us out of the current logjam we're in. But I do think fundamental to that for a borough like ours, which is serious about protecting the social mix of our borough, we have to do that by putting back local authorities and housing associations as major players in the development industry, because that's how we get the social mix we want.
Other questions? Yes, right at the back there in front of the camera. Let's see if, just wait for the microphone for a few seconds.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Girling, Girling's Retirement Rentals Limited. I've been involved with the provision of housing for some 35 years, and certainly I agree with the concerns that have been voiced about planning delays. My hair went white trying to get planning permissions. I succeeded in doing 3 developments and then gave up and handed it over to the people who had more patience than I. But the question that I would like to ask, and I think it's of Lord Hague, is that it appears to me that we don't take housing in this country seriously. There's no proper joined-up thinking. Why haven't we got a cabinet minister with a housing appointment? Why do we see every year, year on year, a new housing minister? They change as frequently as I change my handkerchief. And quite frankly, we don't have any continuity of thinking or guidance from government on this. And we hear that the government is saying that they're talking and telling the local authorities to speed up the planning process, and the local authorities don't take any notice at all. Thank you.
Very good. Now, you're not meant to ask me questions. This is against the rules. And if your hair went white doing that, look what happened to me being Foreign Secretary for a few years. But anyway, I'm sure we take your point that, in fact, I've always made the point that ministers do best if they have 4 or 5 years, let's say, in a particular portfolio. After that, they've used all their best ideas, and they've maybe been there a bit too long. But they need time, like in any job, to get on top of the brief, and the housing hasn't always had that. And yet we could debate whether it's been senior enough in any government recently, which is really, this is obviously the point that you're making. Does anybody want to make a quick comment about that?
If I could, yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I've been at Aldermore since 2010. I think we're on our 5th housing minister. It's astonishing. The other thing is, of course, it's not joined up. You're absolutely right. So you've got planning over there. You've got, housing supply over here. You've got purchases over there. It's not at all joined up. So I think there's a real, given that this is now one of the big government policy initiatives, we need to see an initiative that joins it up, frankly, as quickly as possible. Totally agree. Yeah.
Right, it looks like there's a consensus about
there has
this.
to be buy-in, cross-party buy-in. Housing crisis is not a 5-year political term. It's a 30-year challenge. And unfortunately, political ambitions sometimes get in the way of effectively the housing solution. And that is maybe taken away ultimately from central government and put into a task force with cross-party support to deal with these issues. So.
Right, well, I've retired from government, but I will tell my old friends that there's a clear message coming out about this. Who would like to raise the next question? Yes, here.
Thank you. Simon Jeffrey from Countryside. We were talking a lot about SMEs, and in terms of local authorities and larger housing associations, you have quite large and, well, strict restrictions in terms of requirements for funding, track record, liability insurances, those sorts of aspects. And I guess the question really is, if you had a choice between an SME with those limitations, or otherwise a larger house builder, who would you prefer to work with?
I think, Kate, do you want to take that?
I think we like the large house builders on the whole because they know what we are and they're used to working with us and they are ready for us and we can get on with it, really. Having said that, we are not all averse to smaller builders or developers working with us under all sorts of circumstances. So it sort of depends what the scheme is and under what conditions. I mean, I don't have an ideological problem either way myself.
Richard, yeah.
From a local authority point of view, I think it can be often horses for courses. So, the nice thing about Islington's infill approach to estate regeneration, actually it does come up with a lot of quite nice small schemes which are very much appropriate and do go to small and medium-sized construction companies. What we are looking for, though, is from our builders recognising they're working in existing communities, recognising they're working alongside people's homes, and there are kids who need to do homework, and there are people who need to go to the shops, and so these are not traditional construction sites. So that level of kind of community sensitivity and community engagement is really key for us. And if we can find SME builders who really get that, and often SME builders are better at that kind of stuff than the big guys, then we're really interested in working with them.
And Neil, do you want to answer that?
Only to say, at HBC, I mentioned our role, but we're, as an insurance company, of course, we're thinking about the underwriting aspects of what we're doing. And I think from our point of view, we're always looking to see what's the abilities of the builder who's doing the work and what's the project that's involved and making sure that they're well matched. And I agree with the comments that are made. It's all about really matching companies with projects, and that's the key to success in terms of quality and customer satisfaction.
Okay, and what about, we've only got a few minutes left of this panel, what about the point that was raised at the beginning by Richard about skills, about the mismatch between the expectations of the industry and the output of education and training in the UK? Do any of the panelists have anything to say on that point? Mark?
I can briefly touch upon our construction team find it increasingly difficult to get hold of the skills, the local skills. It's written into most of the Section 106 agreements we have to use local labour, and we do our best to use local labour, but that, add a consequence to sometimes the deliverability of the scheme. And therefore we have to look wider to larger subcontractors who are also under the same level of pressures on different sites, not getting paid. I know there's been a lot of cost inflation in the market, so actually finding those skills, and I think the shortage was created straight after the crash, 4 or 5 years of gap, is very, very difficult, and something needs to be done about that.
Okay, let me bring in a couple. Is it on this point? Yes, gentleman just here, and then we'll go over to Colin, who's now in the audience. Yes.
Thank you. Darren Nathan from Durkin, so we're a developer and a contractor. It's nice to hear Mark make the first mention today about the increasing costs that have hit the industry from 2008 to 2016 and the impact that had. The industry actually lost around about 350,000 workers in the period of the recession where work stopped. And that has to be recognised when we're talking about bringing things forward. Very disappointed to hear Islington's experience of contractors, because both, I would say, us and our peers do so much work training young people and adult training that I think actually the finger that is often levelled at the construction industry for not doing enough does not recognise just how much the construction industry does do. And it's important to recognise that the The kid that comes out of school today that gets trained is not going to have the experience that is required to lay the brick and do the plastering. There has to be a mentoring program. So there's got to be a real push on getting some of the older workers back into the sector, encouraging them to act as mentors and trainers for the people that we're working with.
Colin, you wanted to, let's just pass the microphone over to him on the front row there.
Thank you. Yes, just to say that the London Chamber about a year and a half ago did some pipeline work with the help of KPMG, which discovered that across the board, when it came to construction skills, there was a 20% lack, just everywhere. I think one of the problems is the fact that the colleges and the industry are not necessarily aligned in the right way. You have certain construction companies saying, look, you know, they're teaching old skills when we want other new skills. I mean, for example, prefabricated building methods. And of course, the colleges are talking about, well, we need to fulfill these things to get bums on seats. And I think there has to be some new work done to try and make sure that we get those people in. And the schools themselves need to see construction as a place where their kids can go. I mean, actually, in your borough, we had a company that you know, I think, Richard, which tried to go into schools about painting and decorating. And from 5 schools, it got the message, we don't want our kids to be painters and decorators, as if this was something ghastly that you might end up doing, rather than a trade that you could make a business out of and a good livelihood.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to come back on that?
I do. I mean, yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that some constructors and developers are doing the right thing. I mean, I'm simply honestly reflecting back on the conversations that we had, mostly with some of the big guys actually, about their approach to all of this, which is why, we don't need to do this, and we're not going to spend the money on doing it, which I think was very disappointing. Colin, you're absolutely right to talk about, and I can name them, Kevin McLaughlin, who did a fantastic job in training young painters and decorators to go into the trade. And actually, as a council, we played a really good role. We got Kevin some free premises to do that kind of work from. And in the end, it was us as a local authority that brokered the relationship between the schools and the company that got a bigger pipeline of people coming through. What in the end did for that was the fact the skills funding system meant it became increasingly difficult for the college, the things funded through, to draw down the money to do that. And the core here for me is that there are too many different players within government trying to look at this. The skills funding is nationally set against a very, very inflexible set of priorities. And I think the biggest thing we have to do to unlock this is get skills funding devolved to London to actually mean that, you know, there's someone with a bit of a grip on reality with spending that money. But the other thing is actually have a bigger conversation where industry recognises it has to start to grow its own, which it has not been a recognition. I think the industry is widely shared for a bit, if I want to be challenging. But also then recognise that the people providing those services have to change dramatically as well. And I really think this is an example where the industry itself has to be provided with a lot of the funding to do the training, because in the end it's you guys who know what you want your people to do.
Well, we've run out of time for this panel, but there is more. We could go on. These are fascinating issues, but I think you'll all agree we've had a very expert panel once again. And often these sorts of panels don't really produce any clear direction, let's be honest, but this one has actually, because there is a lot of, there have been a lot of ideas here, and quite a bit of a consensus about how if someone was powerful enough, or if a partnership of across sectors was creative and worked together closely enough, there is a whole set of things that can be done on planning, on finance, on land availability, on skills, that actually, if you could do all of those things, would make an enormous difference. With a housing minister in the cabinet to push it all through. So thank you very much for that, and we'll move straight on to our next session, just for the next half hour before we have our next break. So please thank these panelists, and we will welcome some new ones. Thank you. Thanks very much. Of land, can they have more partnerships with house builders. Both organizations have worked with residential developers in the past. They appear to be looking to do more. We have Howard Dorber of Canary Wharf Group, who can talk housing, offices, and transport in terms of a collaborative approach. And while Richard McCarthy is, he's here too. He's all about strategy and joined-up property delivery, optimizing assets, public and private sector, working together. So we'll get comments from all four of them, and the one who's going to kick it off this time is Graham Craig from Transport for London. Graham.
Thank you very much. This question is one that I think we continue.
Can you hear Graham all right? Yes? Not particularly well.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes, you can. I can
yes,
hear
I think
it coming
so,
through.
Yeah.
This, I was saying, is a lesson that we continue to have to learn. Despite all the evidence, transport built this city. The relationship between development and transport was understood 100 years ago when Metroland was being built. Canary Wharf exists because of the transport links. And yet at the same time, because Jubilee Line Extension was a transport project, 16 years on, there's been no development above Southwark Tube Station and Bermondsey Tube Station. In terms of other parts of the world, MTR in a different environment is, the classic example of an organization that has no difficulty reconciling the fact that it is both a major property company and a transport organization and understands the links between those two. On a smaller scale, for present, TfL now accepts that we are a property company. Commercial development, where I sit, is one of 3 operating businesses within Transport for London: London Underground, Surface Transport, and Commercial Development. So I am tasked with generating £1.1 billion to reinvest in the transport system through development activity, and need to do that alongside 50% affordable housing as an average across all of our portfolio. That's a not insubstantial task. It's one that's best done in conjunction, particularly with other parts of the public sector. We work well with Network Rail on a site-by-site basis, and there are a number of deals we're doing at the moment. But we have 250 adjoining interests with Network Rail across London. Myself and my opposite numbers in Network Rail are working through actually what would a portfolio-wide approach look like? How can we in particular make sure that when Crossrail 2 comes along, which is resolutely not just a transport project, that's one that has to deliver 200,000 jobs, 200,000 homes as an integral part of the investment in the railway. That's going to require us to be much more joined up across the public sector and working very closely with developers. So we're working with large developers on our larger sites. We're going to be entering into a series of joint ventures. We had our first site announced a couple of months ago at Kidbrooke, and thereafter we'll be bringing sites forward at the rate of 1 a month, working with large developers. We're also going to be working, or I am keen that we work, and we will do, we'll be working with SMEs, community land trusts. We've got lots of small sites across London. These aren't appropriate for large developers, and we've got the opportunity, building on what was said in the previous session, to support a whole range of industry. And we're going to have to work imaginatively to make sure that we can help to foster that and make it happen. We've also got opportunities across a number of other sites that fall somewhere between the two. Now, this requires a major scaling up from Transport for London. It means that we need to be employing, experienced property professionals within our structure, and the governance arrangements and the support and the financing that reflect the fact that that we are a property company, not one that's capable of doing everything by ourselves, but the organization that's actually best able to address many of the issues, particularly in terms of those complex operational interfaces. I guess the final thing that I'll say in terms of summing up, we ran some focus groups earlier this year just to check with the people who use our network how they feel about us doing development around our stations. And we asked them a simple question: should we sell off our land in order to keep fares down, or should we be investing, building homes above our network so that we are providing homes that Londoners can afford. Unequivocally, unambiguously, what people wanted was us to be building homes. And in the course of those short discussions, they went from being quizzical as to why they're being asked this by TfL to getting really quite annoyed that this isn't something that we had been doing. I think the housing, we all talk about it, biggest single crisis this city faces, the most obvious, logical, sensible place to build is on the transport network. We have to be more joined up in order to make sure that that actually happens at the pace that's required.
Right, thank you. Well, real determination there from TfL to join things up in a way that hasn't always been done successfully before. So thank you for kicking things off with that. Nigel, do you want to speak about the perspective from Network Rail now?
Sure, yeah. I think it's worth breaking it down into two categories. There's the transport organisations get involved with the really longer-term major projects, HS2 and Crossrail 2 that you mentioned. That's a great opportunity to make sure that housing potential, any development potential, is considered as part of a whole design and delivery process for a transport scheme. Seems to be going on and off from the mic.
Take that one.
Can I borrow that?
Yeah.
So there's an opportunity for an integrated approach for the big, major, long-term schemes. But there's a second category of opportunity outside of those major infrastructure projects, where Network Rail is already working very hard to release as much land as it can at the moment for housing, without impacting on rail activity and rail projects, but actually in a way that might enhance develop station facilities, transport facilities on the back of residential or other development schemes, and doing it in such a way that works with local communities. And I think that's the area that Network Rail will make the most impact over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, up to sort of the March 2020 time. You might have seen recently we've announced plans that we're finalising a programme, and we're working on this programme right now, that will release land for housing by 2020, that will create 12,000 homes close to the rail infrastructure across the country. And for London, I think it's about just over 5,000 homes. And we've identified 60 sites that we're working on within London, and we'd hope to outperform that. And the way to deliver those projects, we take various approaches, the sort of more conventional site-by-site individual approach, working with a developer on an individual site. We also have our own joint venture vehicles in play, which we will use, such as Solum with Kia, and then talking about SMEs earlier, we work with Block and do a number of schemes with Block. So they range from sort of 30 houses up to several hundred houses. And with all those approaches, we're looking at a new one, which is putting out a package in the spring of next year of launching 6 to 8 sites as a single package out there, select a developer to work closely with us. If that works well, we'll roll more of those out. But with all those approaches, it requires quite detailed collaboration and consultation across the industry, within Network Rail, with our own strategic rail planners, with our core customers, the train operating companies and freight companies, passengers, transport executives, a whole range of stakeholders that we get involved with our projects. So I suppose going back to the question in a way, is there joined up thinking? There has been and there is joined up thinking, but clearly there's always opportunities to do more, greater collaboration and closer working. But Network Rail definitely is committed to making sure that we create great places in and around stations and provide opportunities for the greater good of the development world to deliver on our land bank.
Okay, thank you. So Network Rail and TfL both giving stating a clear ambition here. Howard, do you want to give us some of the experience of Canary Wharf?
Yes, well, Canary Wharf is new to residential, but we've got quite a bit of experience of building on the back of transport infrastructure investment. I should say, although we're new to residential, it will be at least half of everything we do in the future. So Canary Wharf has very much transitioned from a predominantly office developer to an office and residential developer. In fact, we've got 4,300 units at the moment, which we have planning permission for, which we're bringing forward. 800 at Shell on the South Bank, jointly with Qatari DR, and 3,500 at Canary Wharf. And half of all that at Canary Wharf will be PRS, will be rental, will be direct rental. And in fact, the longer we go on, the more we see that as an attractive option for us. Canary Wharf, as Graham said, was built on transport and built on effectively three increasingly good deals. The first one was the DLR, originally built prior to even the idea of Canary Wharf and designed to service the Docklands development. But the extension of DLR to Bank, we contributed £125 million towards that. And that was just a cheque. It wasn't very sophisticated. It was basically just a payment towards the cost of that line. When it came to the Jubilee line a few years later, we actually had a much better deal, which was a contract with London Underground. We provided £400 million towards the Jubilee line extension, but the contract meant that the line had to be built to certain specifications and run a certain number of trains an hour, which in fact it didn't. We then had an argument with Transport for London that they hadn't delivered the service that we expected, and we ended up effectively winning some money back from our 400 million, and then working with central government and TfL to fix the signalling problems. But that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had that contract. So our active involvement in the delivery of the transport scheme helped deliver an improvement to the transport scheme, which then in turn developed the next phase of Canary Wharf. With Crossrail, we've actually got to a much higher level of sophistication, because within the funding of Crossrail and within the funding of the Crossrail station, we anticipated the increase in value of the Canary Wharf estate and indeed other developments around it. So we were able to take a cost on Crossrail that was 1.2 billion in the original government books, which is 800 million plus the Treasury's optimism bias, which was 40%. We work on an optimism bias of about 2% in our construction. If it's 2% out, we're going to fire somebody. So the 40% we always thought was a little bit over the top. But we managed to take that 1.2 billion, deliver the station ourselves for a fixed cost of 500 million, and of that make a direct contribution ourselves of 212 million towards the cost of the station. So we took a very expensive station and, using the value of the development that was going to be built on the back of it, managed to get the cost way down. And I think there's some models there for Crossrail 2 and for Network Rail. It's clear that transport delivers an increase in property values, delivers the capability, the opportunity to develop housing in places where housing wouldn't otherwise work. And that future value can be used to help fund the transport investment. But we need to get the right balance, and particularly with Transport for London's target of 50% of affordable housing, we need to look at the balance of what goes into funding transport infrastructure and what goes into funding affordable housing. Because if we're going to deliver houses in the private sector that are genuinely affordable for people to buy, then we need to be developing houses in the sort of £200,000, £300,000 bracket. And if you look at Barking, there's whole swathes of Barking, swathes of North Bexley, where it is possible to deliver houses with gardens that people want to live in at a reasonable cost, but the transport just isn't there. And we need to look at how we use some of that value to put into transport and balance that off against the affordable housing requirements. So I'm looking forward. We're one of the companies on the roster for TfL. I think the Kidbrooke is quite an exciting opportunity. I think Euston is going to be very exciting for Network Rail as well. And I think there's some big opportunities in London.
Thank you. So everybody so far is determined there will be more joined-up thinking than in the past, and is giving examples of that. Richard McCarthy, do you want to round off the panel and give us your comments on these things?
Thank you. So it was on a visit to Rochdale a few years ago with a certain Deputy Prime Minister, where we looked at the industrial past and amazed at ourselves at the extent to which, in our past, and fairly recent past, we turned our back on water. Now, you all know in this room, it's second nature now. Water brings value when you're developing residential schemes. The truth is, as Graham rightly said, we're just at the start of really understanding how the juxtaposition of residential, of housing and infrastructure can do so much more. We are all guilty in this room, all of us, and me as a past policy official, responsible, by the way, for housing and planning, actually have used stations, have walked past, driven past places, which we're now looking at and saying, do you know what, they are available for housing development. Tony Pitchley is in the next panel. Tony built his career and his business partly by spotting land that others failed to recognize was available for residential development. So we are learning, and that's a really important point. I can't tell you, but I can hint at the struggle to make sure that we kept the link on Crossrail down to South East London, not a well-known part to large parts of government, but actually taking the Crossrail down to Abbey Wood is transformative in the impact it will have on residential development in an area of low density, poor mix, and real potential. So I think I just want to focus on 3 words very briefly, and they're P, S, and I. So I'm delighted where we are with TfL and where we are with Network Rail, and we should celebrate that, but we absolutely should not be satisfied. We need pace. We know politicians want pace. We need to think ways of delivering things faster now we've pushed open the door. We need scale. I think pace can create opportunities to do more things at the same time. And thirdly, that requires a bit more imagination and a bit more innovation. And those are both in what can be done, in the way that our public sector institutions engage the minds and the thoughts of the private sector earlier on in the stage. I still think there's a little bit of a mindset, I've seen it, I've probably been part of it, of the public sector wanting to get it all right first before it puts it out for the private sector to engage. So my challenge, and I think our opportunity is, let's do some stuff earlier. Let's go and explore the potential before we've actually closed off what that potential is, and then put it out to the market. Because that way, I think we can get pace, and we can get scale, and we can do that through greater imagination.
Thank you. Well, there's a clear challenge. We're at the start, you said, of understanding the juxtaposition of transport and infrastructure, which does raise important questions about what we've been doing before, if that is the case, but a real need for imagination in order to make the most of that now. So let's have we don't have much time, let's have questions immediately from the floor on these matters. Who wants to ask about infrastructure? Looks like your call for imagination has not yet borne fruit. So, yes, here. Yeah.
I'll do another one. Simon Jeffrey from Countryside. In terms of the panel for TfL, for example, there's a lot going on in terms of more central parts of London in the major infrastructure. I'd be quite keen to understand the progress in terms of working with developers on your sort of Zone 3 outwards schemes, and also for Network Rail in terms of moving on rather than just your joint ventures, such as with Solum, working with other developers on their land holdings. Okay, well, that's a very specific question for Graham, first of all.
Okay, so we have 75 sites we're bringing forward, 2/3 in zones 1 and 2, 300 acres, 10,000 homes. In parallel with taking those forward, we're also looking to see, and those will come forward at the rate of 1 a month, in parallel, we're looking to see what else we have. We've identified a similar number of sites, largely in zones 3 and 4. So next year, we'll be looking to bring those forward. We've got work to do between now and then as to whether that's a single package, whether it's on a site-by-site basis. There are lawyers who we have to get on board on these things, as keen as I am to engage the market. Actually, no, let me say, if given we're talking about tens of sites in outer London, ideal for residential development, particularly build to rent, if there are those in the audience, and I spot at least a couple, who may have ideas along those lines, more than happy to see you afterwards about your ideas for what we can do with those sites. As well as those sites, we'll also then be looking at the smaller sites which are across London that are ideal for SMEs and self-build. So we end up 3 tranches, zones 1 and 2, large developers, zones 3 and 4, opportunity maybe for a build-to-rent portfolio, and then small sites working with SMEs.
Nigel?
Well, for Network Rail, thank you. For Network Rail, we've got about 60 sites in London, as well as we've got 3 joint venture arrangements, but actually we're working with about 15 to 20 other developers at the moment across a number of sites. So we're not a closed shop just to JV, we're very much open for business, and certainly you'll see a new package, a bit similar to Graham actually. We're going through that analysis about which sites are appropriate for an individual arrangement, or which sites can we put into a multi-site package, and we expect in the spring of next year we'll have a package of about 8 to 10 sites in London that we'll put out to the market to select a developer for. And actually that's starting to address the point that was made earlier, which is around getting some pace into it. I think Network Rail is actually quite proud of what it's done over the years in terms of unlocking land, but there's absolutely much more that can be done. We've identified around 200 sites, as I say, across the country, and 60 or so in London. And it's about putting that pace in by putting out the multi-site package in the spring. If that starts to work, then we will certainly launch some more as the year goes on and into 2018.
Thank you. Other questions? Rupert.
Yes, Rupert Bates, WhatHouse. Obviously, Graham, if you do speak to any developers, our introductory fees are quite reasonable. But well, actually, I wanted to go on the build-to-rent model. I know we've got essential living for one in the room. Is there, for the panel, is there more partnership opportunity, maybe in terms of holding onto the asset, working in partnership with developers, or are we talking about selling the asset, selling the crown jewels?
Who wants to take this? Nigel? Yeah, and then Howard.
Yeah, I don't think it's a question of selling the crown jewels. It's about getting best value out of the land. Network Rail's part of public ownership, and we're required really to get the best use of land and the best value out of land. So we will work with developers, local authorities and the like to get the best value out. If that means a PRS type scheme, then fine. But it's not necessarily something that we'll be wanting to retain and hold an interest in ourselves. We're not experts in that area. Network Rail is a core rail infrastructure organisation, but we will make the best use of its assets. So it's about getting best value, and I think it's down to the market and developers and working with the developers to decide on the best route.
Howard?
I think there is a huge opportunity here. Obviously, our office model for 30 years has been based on two fundamentals. You get rent, and there's a capital value of the building. There's a capital value of the building with the tenants in it, and there's a capital value without tenants in it. With PRS, you get an income stream, and you also have a capital value of that building. And in fact, there's an asset class there which doesn't really exist in London at the moment, but on which the whole of the eastern seaboard, in fact the eastern and western seaboard of the United States is built on, which is individual buildings owned by one company or an investor, 200 or 300 units, and well-managed long-term tenancy agreements. And that is a very, very saleable asset. It's not possible at the moment, if you've got £500 million to spend, to buy a single piece of London property with an income stream in the residential sector that will deliver that. So there's a massive opportunity here to create that asset class, and that's one of the reasons why half of what we're doing is PRS. But I think it is one of the things that I think both Network Rail and TfL are certainly looking at and should be looking at, because MTR were mentioned before. They generate between 200 and 800 million pounds a year in Hong Kong from their residential and other property investments, and there's an income stream in perpetuity there that I think could be very useful for funding transport.
And Richard?
I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that you can create income streams, revenue streams, as that's what the particular need for the public sector body is in different ways. So you may quite rightly decide you don't have the skill set to be involved as some sort of equity partner in actually a residential scheme like an essential living scheme for build to rent. But actually you might decide to take just a lease rental, i.e. take a leasehold payment per annum as opposed to a capital payment up front for disposal of the land. So I think there are ways ways of structuring different deals that work best for the individual public owner. And if I could just take this very brief second just to clarify your point about the juxtaposition. We've all known and talked about for some time about putting in transport hubs and exploiting the opportunity that those create around them. And yet we have all walked past and used opportunities in our existing network and not seen how we could be exploiting the land in, on, over the transport hub to create places to live, which aren't just a requirement, but actually would now be seen as highly desirable. We've got much better ability to manage noise. We have young people now who aren't interested in owning cars, traveling around London, who just use the network of transport as a way of navigating their way constantly around London. And they find living on top of a railway line a highly attractive proposition in the way that we might have not seen in the past. So things are changing. And you do need to be careful about sometimes some of the policy positions that people adopt, which reflect the past rather than a forward-looking look about the way society thinks itself.
Well, again, a good note to conclude on. We've run out of time. We're ready for a break. You all look ready for a break, actually. But that's been another fascinating session with some clear opportunities for the future and determination for the future. More than £1 billion from TfL. Sites for thousands of housing units from Network Rail, thousands more at Canary Wharf. A lot of opportunities to think about for the future and a lot of determination here on the panel to make the most of that. So thank you to another very good expert panel. Give them a round of applause. Thank you.